This morning we'll discuss the evolution of PBIS and look at the 5 core features of PBIS. We'll also discuss how the role of the team has changed and how different types of data are used to guide the decisions made by the team. We'll spend the afternoon looking at feedback as part of the instructional model. If we think about teaching behavior, as we do academics, through an instructional lens, we consider the way that feedback, both specific positive feedback and corrective feedback, support the development of behavioral skills and emphasizes why it's important to create that safe and trusting environment in order for learning to take place. The Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI, line items that this session most strongly align with are items 1.13, database decision making, 1.9, feedback and acknowledgement, and 1.6, discipline policies. We know that there's a lot of content to cover today, and by no means would we expect you or want you to action plan around everything that we cover. So please make sure to use your reflection document to note areas that you would like to explore more with your team or areas that you would like additional support from your Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator. Recorders, could you please enter those 2 to 3 words that your group captured as common themes to what do most people in your school think when they hear PBIS?
Hey, so I am seeing school expectations, positive whole group rewards, rewards and celebrations, modeling, focus on rewards and parties, lots about the rewards and parties, fidelity, positivity. Hey, great one. It's about changing the adult behavior to help impact student behaviors. Awesome. Model behavior expectations. Inconsistent usage, focus on rewards. Consistent language, positive behavior system, acknowledgements.
All right, well, thank you, Jen. So now we're going to look to see how those ideas either align or don't align with how PBIS has evolved as we move throughout the day. So it's important to remember that PBIS is not a program, it's a framework, and it's aligned within an equitable multi-level system of support. The fundamental purpose is to make our schools more effective and equitable learning environments. So remembering Dr. Neese's keynote on Monday, brain research shows that in order to make learning possible, there needs to be a sense of physical, emotional, and social safety. When we hear the word safe, we might think about teaching safe behaviors, but we also need to think about ensuring that everyone feels comfortable, that they feel like they belong, and that each and every student knows that they are an important and valued member of our school and classroom community. This is an especially important consideration as we look to going back to school and its numerous variations. Our teams are going to need to identify and support all staff in delivering the practices that will help to create a sense of both physical and emotional safety in school, whether we're talking about in-person school, remote learning, or a hybrid of the two. We also have positive environments that support the relationship building. This doesn't just pertain to relationships between teachers and students, but also peer-to-peer. We need to consider the adult practices that help to develop nurturing, supportive environments within the walls of our classroom and within our whole school building. Creating a predictable environment where everyone knows what to expect makes us feel more secure and ready to learn. All students and staff will function better when their environment is predictable, consistent, positive, and safe. And so finally, consistency is a key ingredient to PBIS. It doesn't mean that every single student behavior event has the same outcome. It means that we identify, define, train, and support the adult behaviors necessary to create those predictable, positive, and safe environments so that all adults respond consistently. Consistency becomes part of our culture and requires systemic implementation. So that systems change is a combination of both adaptive and technical challenges. It's important to note that one is not more important, necessarily easier to implement, or better than the other. However, in education, as in other areas of our life, we tend to lean into technical challenges more quickly because the solutions are ones that can be addressed through our current ways of being. Adaptive challenges, on the other hand, are less tried and true. We have to consider different ways of being, and it requires us to learn new ways of doing things that might include changing attitudes, mindsets, or beliefs. Whereas technical challenges can often be planned through things like checklists and familiar processes, adaptive challenges are more ambiguous and unpredictable. So let's think about an example that might be outside of education. If we're going to use like a medical example, if I were diagnosed with a heart condition, there'll be some technical and some adaptive challenges in order to manage that new diagnosis. So I'm going to want to lean into those technical changes where I'll have the technical expertise of a physician to prescribe perhaps some medication, or that technical expertise to perform a surgery. But there's also going to be some adaptive challenges that I'm going to have to consider. Things that I'm going to have to look at in terms of changing my attitudes, my beliefs, or possibly my habits related to some lifestyle choices. Things like my diet, my exercise, or stress management. So if we look at those two types of challenges and we apply that then to our education and more specifically to PBIS implementation, we can see that a lot of the work with PBIS is focused on some of those technical changes that are necessary for implementation. So things like matrices and T-charts. And although those technical pieces are important, there are also some adaptive challenges that need to be addressed. Things about mindsets and beliefs about how behavior is learned, or beliefs about punishment. And it's important in leading this work of systems change to be able to determine which challenges are technical and which are adaptive so that the solutions match the challenge. So we'll bring a little bit more clarity to the differences by looking at the following distinctions. With technical challenges, the change is often incremental and linear. Think about those check boxes and flowcharts. However, with adaptive challenges, they're often more complex and less predictable, so they're nonlinear in nature. We can often use lessons or existing ways of knowing when the challenge is technical, but with adaptive challenges, we're often asked to think outside the box, imagine new ways of working, or leverage the expertise within our buildings differently. It's a break with the past. Similarly, with technical challenges, the changes are often consistent with our organization's prevailing norms or paradigms, whereas with adaptive challenges, we're often asked to shift our mindsets and beliefs in order to adopt new norms or paradigms. So with that in mind, the change from technical challenges often seems marginal to the organization, whereas with adaptive challenges, when we're doing the work of shifting mindsets and beliefs, our change means disrupting the current systems. So, take a minute to individually reflect on the following. Has the work of your PBIS team been more heavily technical or adaptive, or a combination of the two? Are there situations where your team has tried to address an adaptive challenge, things with mindsets or beliefs, with a technical solution? So use your reflection document right now to jot down some of your thoughts. All right. So on this slide, we're going to talk through a little bit about how PBIS has evolved from the initial interpretations. We've learned that PBIS is most effective and sustainable when it's aligned within an equitable multi-level system of support and the key system features. So much of the initial interpretation was technical, important, but not enough. The evolution of PBIS that's aligned within an equitable multi-level system of support addresses some of the adaptive work that was not explicitly or intentionally addressed in our original iterations. So let's look at some of the examples of this evolution. Originally, PBIS focused on behavioral compliance and procedural routines, the how to do school. Things like walking on the right side of the hallway, or 2 pumps of soap and 2 paper towels. And it's not that those things are not important or that they're no longer needed, especially when we consider the procedural routines that we'll have to teach and support when students return to school in its various formats in our current realities. But we need to also think beyond those compliance expectations and procedural routines when considering behavioral skills. We pay special attention to proactively creating positive environments for all students that will support the learning and development of those social, emotional, and academic enabler skills. PBIS has moved beyond simply teaching kids the procedures and routines of the schools and how to comply with adult directives to specifically defining and teaching the social, emotional, and behavioral skills that students need to be successful, including those academic enabler skills necessary for college and career readiness. Originally, the instruction of behavior was often taught as a one-time event. Teams planned kickoffs or back-to-break boosters and created cool tools for staff to access in binders. We now look at teaching behavior through an instructional lens similar to academics. Knowing that we wouldn't teach an academic skill like fractions in a large group assembly in September and expect that all students would be successful, we apply that same instructional lens to teaching behavior. The instruction is ongoing and provided in the natural context. This brings us to the next item. Our PBIS work used to focus heavily on the common areas of school. Think like cafeterias, hallways, playgrounds, etc. Knowing that students spend the majority of their day in the classroom environment has a much stronger emphasis than in the past. In the initial interpretation of PBIS, tangible rewards were often the focus when talking about acknowledging behavior. Knowing that tangibles were never meant to be the it of reinforcement, they were intended to be the reminder to the adults in the system to give the it, which is specific positive feedback. Sometimes in creating our tangible acknowledgement systems, we might have lost sight of that verbal feedback that's always intended to accompany the tangibles. So now specific positive feedback is seen as part of that instructional practice that supports learning, and the use of tangibles are messaged as an additional optional tool. The work of PBIS teams originally functioned more like committees and spent much of their time producing products such as matrices, flowcharts, cool tools, and T-charts and planning events like school-wide celebrations, kickoffs, and boosters. We know that PBIS can't be a binder of documents created by a few and distributed to staff. So our training continues to be offered in teams, and during that training, teams are guided to build their own capacity and function as leadership teams. These teams create a plan to train and support the full staff and to engage stakeholders, which means families, students, and communities, in the work. Just like the African adage that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. This new work of the team is really grounded in those key system features of collaboration and strong shared leadership in order to create sustainability. Originally, the main data source that teams used to inform their decisions was student outcome data in the form of office discipline referrals. Think the big five. As PBIS has evolved, teams are asked to consider multiple data sources and to examine student outcomes beyond that of only office discipline referrals. And great attention is given to disaggregating student outcome data and planning around the systemic changes necessary to impact inequitable outcomes of underserved student groups. This is a place where we're really leaning into that accepting institutional responsibility from the model to inform. While schools continue to use tools like the SAS and the TFI to measure the systemic implementation of PBIS, there is an additional focus measuring the impact of training and the support provided to staff as well. So the PBIS framework is largely the same with these 5 core features. And as Dr. Neese spoke in the very beginning about that, with that environment being a very important piece of this. So we're proactively creating those positive relationships with students and families. We're going to define those skills and think about all of those social, emotional, academic enabler, and behavioral skills. And thinking of PBIS as kind of that glue that aligns all of those together within our within our equitable multi-level system of support. And then we're going to teach, prompt, and provide feedback. So we need to support all of the adults within our system with being able to deliver that teaching and provide those prompts and feedback. We're also going to look to providing an instructional response to behavior so that our feedback for our corrective feedback is respectful and it's brief and it's taught through that instructional lens. And then, of course, we're making all of our decisions based on data. So today we're going to focus especially on those last three areas, that specific positive feedback, response to behavioral error, and using data to make decisions. The session is going to lean into those adaptive challenges with PBIS implementation, but we'll still touch on some of those technical pieces as well. In our next section, we're also going to consider the different way a team has to work to support these adaptive challenges. Do your best, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. This quote from Maya Angelou aptly describes our ongoing learning related to the implementation of PBIS within an equitable, multi-level system of support. As you reflect on the evolution slides and this quote by Maya Angelou, consider where your team has already made movements toward this evolution of PBIS, and we heard a number of those in your responses that Jen read. And then where are some areas for growth? Throughout our day, we're going to have you use this triangle, square, circle protocol. So when you use this protocol, the triangle is going to be a place where you'll think about what are three key points that you want to remember from that section. A square is going to be something from that section that resonates with your thinking or squares with your thinking. And then a circle is going to be something that's still circling in your head. Questions that you might have, concerns or wonders. Okay, so I'll just share out some of the things that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of talk about specific positive feedback being the important piece tied to any tangibles that you're going to use, the importance of shared leadership, that teaching behavior is not a one-time thing, that SEL is included in thinking about behavior, that addressing the mindset of staff is part of this work and that it's everyone's work. So I think I'm seeing those are most of the kind of common themes I'm seeing there.
So are we ready to move on?
I think so.
Okay.
Hi, this is Stephanie, and I'm going to be talking through this section about the role of the team and how that team role has shifted throughout the evolution, as Deidre talked about a little bit. So for starters, I want you to reflect on the top 2 to 3 responsibilities your PBIS leadership team spends time doing. Perhaps you look at data by referral to identify your precision statement. Maybe you develop booster sessions based on that data and plan staff and student celebrations. I know some of you mentioned celebrations or rewards when you chatted out. Take a minute to individually reflect and use the reflection document to record your thoughts and thank you everybody for doing some reflection. Often our PBIS teams are functioning more like committees than leadership teams. Committees tend to be more short-term, project-oriented, and task-based in nature. The work of the leadership team serves a different purpose. They support the development, refinement, and sustainability of strong systems and supports. Both types of teams are important, but different. This new way of functioning for the team needs to be more like that of a leadership team as opposed to a committee. As I talk about the changing role of the team, consider the current functions of your team. How might your team use the content in this section to start identifying areas your team functions more like a committee and can begin to shift to function more like a leadership team? The team trained support model redefines the role of the team. Historically, the role of the team has been to broadly define the critical components of PBIS, provide one and done training to staff that attend in-services, and give each staff member a binder full of artifacts that was hopefully referenced, tasks that could be assigned to a committee. The redefined role of the leadership team is to clearly define the critical elements of PBIS in practice and to contextualize the components to the school setting. Team. The team develops their capacity to implement small trials, using adult practice data to inform decisions before training the entire staff to implement at scale. This allows the team to be better equipped to develop and provide professional development and ongoing support. The team will be supporting the work necessary to identify and define the adult beliefs, skills, and practices necessary to create positive environments and provide universal instruction in behavior. Therefore, they will need to plan for the structures necessary to support each and every adult within the system in the adaptive challenges their work entails, and in developing a clear understanding of the practices and ability to demonstrate them with fidelity. The team makes sure that practices, policies, and procedures are consistently implemented as intended across the school. Staff do not get to choose to not implement, just like we would not allow a teacher to provide a different literacy curriculum than identified by the district. Train. Only after the team has built their understanding and practiced at small scale to identify what works is professional development provided to stakeholders. The team uses a professional development plan that scaffolds learning and application for each practice. Support. The team ensures ongoing support. With ongoing support by the team, stakeholders work together to reflect on current practices and expand, refine, and build new skills. Collaboration is essential for staff to share ideas and teach one another. Support includes coaching. Everyone benefits from coaching. Here are a couple of additional considerations for the team. Make sure to consider communication, which means two-way communication with stakeholders, including staff, students, families, and community, ensuring the system is designed based upon the community we serve. Remember the importance of data so that the team uses various sources of data and teaches staff to utilize data to make decisions. This slide demonstrates the importance of the support piece of the role of the team. If we look at the boxes on the left side of the screen, they define some of the ways that we often provide professional development. The first box is the typical sit and get model, where participants listen to a speaker deliver content and theory. Each box below that is an additional layer to the ones before. So the second box is the presentation of theory and modeling the practice or skill for the participants. For instance, if our outcome was to learn how to provide feedback, the first box would be talking about why feedback is important and talking through the research, while the second box would add on some modeling of what feedback would look like. The third box offers the presentation of theory, models this for participants, and then gives participants the opportunity to practice and also provide and receive feedback. So in our example, this experience would include the presentation, modeling by the presenter, and the opportunity for participants to practice during the training on how to give effective feedback and get their own feedback from the presenter. The final box offers all of the other pieces, but layers on coaching and ongoing support for participants in the work environment, in the actual setting in which they are applying the skills. So in addition to all the pieces described during the actual training, coaching in the work environment occurs. Let's look at the impact of each of these opportunities. Presentation of theory alone shows that 85% of participants are able to show that they understand the concept after the learning opportunity. However, only 15% of participants are able to demonstrate the skill, and only 5 to 10% of the participants will actually use the skill with fidelity in their work environment following the learning opportunity. When we layer on modeling to this learning opportunity, about 85% of participants will be able to show that they understand by explaining the main concept. We have a very slight increase in skill attainment to 18%, but use with fidelity still remains at 5 to 10%. Layering on practice and feedback, the understanding or ability to explain the concept by participants is still at 85%, and their ability to demonstrate the skill during professional development opportunity jumps to 80%. However, the use with fidelity goes up to 10 to 15% only for participants in their work environment. However, with coaching or ongoing planned support within the work environment is where the rubber meets the road. When we layer on coaching, we see that 90% of participants are able to understand and explain the main concept. 90% of participants can demonstrate the skill during the training, and the use with fidelity jumps to 80 to 90% of the participants using the skill effectively and consistently within their work environment. So that is a significant jump in the use of the skill within the actual setting in which they need to utilize a skill. So Dean Fixon is an implementation science expert, and he says the use of an effective intervention without implementation strategies is like serum without a syringe. The cure is available, but the delivery system is not. The role of the team is not to produce the products. It is to create the delivery system to ensure the identified practices are delivered universally with fidelity. So you heard me say collaboration, use of data, ongoing coaching and supports. How are we ensuring as a team that the key features of an equitable multi-level system of support are in place so that our practices are used with fidelity? As you think about the team trained support model that I just talked about, and knowing that you wrote down 2 to 3 top responsibilities that your team spends time doing, I'm going to give you 60 seconds to consider the evolution of the team responsibilities from the committee to the leadership team model of team trained support. What are some areas where your team already operates as a leadership team using the team trained support model? What are some potential barriers as you shift to this type of work? Go ahead.
Okay, great. So if you recall, our first outcome for today was to develop awareness of how data is used to adjust adult practices, and also to think about how we could adjust our school and district policies for equitable outcomes. As we move into some more learning around the evolution of Tier 1, we want to begin with understanding data that we currently review, and then additional data that we could include, such as practice level and system level data. So practice level data and system level data are new to Tier 1 training. We talked about system level data before, but the practice level is an additional layer that we're going to talk about. As schools, districts, we have so much data available to us, and we want to show you how using those different sources of data together can provide a clear picture of the health of your system and how your system is creating the outcomes that you're getting. So when we use all of those sources of data together, it helps examine how our systems impacts on our students and families and how sometimes that can be inequitable. So this is truly when we begin to accept institutional responsibility, when we look back on our systems to determine what is it about the system that's causing those inequities. So we'll get into that concept of accepting institutional responsibility in just a few slides. So let's think about the data that we currently use to inform decisions. This can be at the classroom level or the school level. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds, think on that, and then feel free to enter a few types of data that you use that you can come up with. Just put those in the chat. So we're going to do you see any chats?
Yes, I am seeing office discipline referrals, attendance, positive ticket collection, SAS, TFI, check and check out data, behavioral and academic, using EduClimber, Swiss. I also seeing engagement, which the person said was a new data point that they're using this year.
Awesome. So those are really typical. So you've mentioned quite a few of these, right? So what we want to think about is if we were to disaggregate data. So Deidre mentioned that earlier about disaggregating our data and looking at the different student data that we have listed, we may find some patterns of underserved student groups. For example, we may find that our students with IEPs have lower attendance, lower academic rates, higher rates of behavioral referrals. They may rate our school lower on some school climate surveys. They may not have connections with an adult. So it's really that engagement, right? They have lower engagement. Maybe they're not enrolled in higher level courses. So what we need to think about is is our system not supporting those students in an equitable manner? Which brings me to that next slide. I mentioned I was going to talk about that phrase, accepting institutional responsibility. Well, this is really about the system reflecting upon its responsibility in creating the environment that produces those equitable or inequitable student outcomes that we see. When we reflect on conversations we have in our buildings, they could be worded in such a way that we state students are underperforming. In that manner, we are deflecting and describing responsibility that ultimately is placed back on the students, that it's their responsibility, and that we look to fix those perceived deficits, often based on our stereotypes of students and families. So this really sets the system up to feel that it's outside of the system's sphere of influence. So something we may hear is, we can't do anything about the poverty level in our community. And these attitudes could also hide underlying stereotypes that families maybe don't value education. But if our conversations state that we have student groups that are underserved, then we are reflecting and inspecting and considering the barriers for students and families, knowing that our system is creating those barriers. So what can we do to mitigate for them? What can we do to take responsibility for the outcomes we're getting? So our system is set up to proactively anticipate those potential barriers, to create more equitable access for student groups. So the conversations we may hear are, we can't do anything about the poverty level in our community, which it may be true, but we can mitigate for the barriers that poverty creates. An example of such a barrier may be the assumption of attendance at school events. So a school that I've worked with in southern Wisconsin, they changed a policy of having school performances at the school. They expected the parents, the families, caregivers to drive to the school instead of having the performances brought to the families. And this is in a community where it's an urban school, and there's an outlying community that's more rural where they bus those students into that urban setting. And what they did as a school, they reflected upon it that a lot of those families weren't coming in to their building for the performances, for parent-teacher conferences, and they recognized that there was a barrier there. It was hard for those families to get there. There's a time situation, work, and what they did is they decided we would bring the school, brought the performances out to a community center for that rural community. So they'd bus all the kids out there, they'd do the performance, and then those kids that lived in the community would stay there, and the others would go back to their to the school building and get picked up by parents. Of course, they did the performance first at the school building for all parents as well that could attend there. But they mitigated that barrier so that families could actually see and participate. They did their parent-teacher conferences out at that community center as well. So this is the evolution of PBIS. We accept institutional responsibility and we put the onus back on the system. This is about addressing systemic barriers versus attempting to fix perceived deficits within students and families. Additionally, it highlights an example of adaptive challenges that were mentioned earlier. That with this new work and this new focus on PBIS leadership teams, it's really about inspecting and reflecting and looking at who are our underserved population. So now that you've had a little bit of time to hear about this and just begin those moments of planning, think about how you could possibly bring this back to your team, your building, your district. You'll need to review some data and determine who your underserved student groups are. And I'm actually going to walk you through some of that. So if we make that mind shift of accepting institutional responsibility, then we can really start to understand the need to have our foundation, which is tier 1, supportive of all, which means each and every student group. So if a school reviews their aggregate data, they may fit within the parameters that are listed on your screen. At tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. But if we make that mind shift of accepting institutional responsibility, we are going to want to disaggregate our data so that we can really see the health of our system and the supports that it does or does not provide to each and every student group. With that mind shift, in thinking of that mind shift, we can see this triangle really represents our systemic supports and adult practices. It's really not so much about the representation of our students, but about the supports. So our message around the purpose for this image is to provide a visual that Tier 1 is critical and everyone needs access to Tier 1 universal. Tier 2 and Tier 3 are extensions of the practices and beliefs that are built on the effectiveness of Tier 1. And the efficiency of the PBIS framework depends on that systemic adult practices at the universal level. So when we reflect on the guidance that 80 to 90% of our students should be supported solely at that universal level, we need to look at this through a disaggregated lens. For example, are 80 to 90% of our boys solely supported at the universal level? Are 80 to 90% of our students with IEPs solely supported at that Tier 1 level? Are 80 to 90% of our Indigenous people, or as our federal coding states, Native American students, solely supported at that universal level? Universal is a proactive, supportive level developed specifically for your students, families, and community. And when our universal level is supporting each and every student group, our system will fit within that 80 to 90% parameter. Everyone gets universal. So we need to ensure that all students and staff receive the universal supports through that team trained support model that Stephanie talked about. When you convene with your team and disaggregate your data, do a systems check to see which student groups are underserved. Remember, our new messaging encourages us to accept institutional responsibility by reflecting and inspecting our systems so that's supportive of all of our student groups. So Alexander Dan Heyer is famous for this quote, and there's so much to this, isn't there? So when a gardener notices that the rose bush planted beneath a maple tree isn't growing, the gardener doesn't look at the environment around the bush to determine, is it because the rose doesn't want to grow? Is it because so if we think of that with our students, we can't look at the situation that they're in and think that it's the students, that it's their desire not to grow or not to bloom, but it's really more, what can we do about the environment that we're putting those students in? And how can we bring them into the sun so that they can grow and they can thrive? So give me a thumbs up. Do you agree with this, that it's really about setting the environment up to support our students? So again, the same thing applies for our students. We just want to make sure that we're supporting each and every student group, that we're accepting institutional responsibility. So we're looking at the environments that we set up. So moving on to our next slide, I am going to walk you through a set of long-term summative data to provide an example of how to look at data to determine who underserved student groups could be, and then how we can look at if our system's supporting them. So this is just an example how to use student data for guiding decision-making. Of course, we need to use data for every interaction that we have, everyday interactions, but just as we would look at formative assessment to inform our instruction for academics, we want to also do some long-term or summative data review as well. So for the sake of simplicity, this school has 500 students total enrollment. So you can see how we've laid out the data to review the different subgroups in the school. So let's look at the first row. We can see that the Hispanic Latino subgroup has 60 students, and 38 of those students have 0 to 1 referrals. So in PBIS, we would consider that our universal. That's that supported solely at that universal. So out of this 500 students, 60 are Hispanic. So we're going to focus specifically at that Tier 1 universal, and we're going to review how this plays out on the next slide. And we've actually done calculations for you, but this is a good slide for you to keep in mind that you can come back to, so you can reference it and maybe look at your data as well in the same manner. So on the next slide, as we do a Tier 1 systems check, remember that we want 80 to 90% of our students supported solely at that universal level. So taking our student enrollment from the last slide, we saw that there were 425 students out of the 500 total enrollment, which tells us 85% of our students are supported at the universal level. So we could think, awesome, we're at fidelity, right? That's where, when we start thinking about accepting institutional responsibility, we want to examine those underserved student groups and find out who they are and what supports do we need to put in place to make sure that they're all supported at 85%. So if we take a look at the data from the last slide for the Hispanic Latino student group, we'll divide the 38 students, so those are the ones with the 0 to 1 referrals, into the total enrollment of Hispanic students, which was 60. And with that, we came up with 63% of their student group is supported solely at Tier 1. So considering we want 80 to 90% of our student groups supported solely at the universal level, we can see that in this system, our Hispanic Latino student groups are underserved. So when we look at the data on the left side, we look at that race ethnicity breakdown, which other student groups are being supported solely at the Tier 1 universal level? So go ahead and chat, I'm sorry, which groups are not being supported at that, solely at the universal level? So go ahead and just put some of your thoughts in the chat. Okay, what are they saying?
Black, American, Indian, 2 or more, and then someone mentioned that the Asian population is right at 80%, so we might want to monitor.
Awesome. So yes, you're right. So we can see that there are some additional underserved populations based on race and ethnicity. So now we're going to add some data to the right-hand side of the screen. And we can see that students with and without IEPs. So if we look at the students with IEPs, we can see that 30 out of those 60 are supported solely at the universal level. So that gives us a 50%. And then when we look at the next set of data, students with low socioeconomic status, we can see that that group as well is underserved by our system. It's at 70%. And then finally, if we look at gender, we can see that our males are supported at 71% compared to our females at 98.8%. So would you agree, looking at this data, that we can see that there's some student groups of color, students with IEPs, students experiencing poverty, and boys at the universal level are not being supported by this system. So give me a thumbs up if you agree to that. So when this school dug into the data, what they did find is that the vast majority of their office discipline referrals were from students experiencing poverty, and they were for homework completion or non-completion. So the students were required to go to homework club. So not only did the school recognize that this policy affected some student groups more than others, but they also noted that teachers were writing office discipline referrals for minor behaviors when we know best practices that ODRs or office discipline referrals should be reserved for unsafe or dangerous behaviors. So when we reflect on the system, they recognize that their current policy on homework impacts some student groups more than others. So some students may not have workspace or time. Some students in middle school or high school are working jobs. Some elementary students' parents work incredibly long hours. So they thought through how their policies are providing advantages to some students and disadvantages to other students. So let's just go with this idea of homework policy, because a lot of schools deal with this. We need to take into consideration the community that we serve. And if the families and the students that live in this community are families and students experiencing poverty. So I think it's important to note that the number of hours a person has to work at a minimum wage job to afford a 2-bedroom apartment on average in the state of Wisconsin is something like 96 hours. So this data is taken from the National Low Income Housing Coalition in Wisconsin. And I do have a slide at the end of the presentation today with this research information, so you can look at it. But just think about that, 96 hours. That's a huge amount of time for those parents to be working, and probably at different hours. So if you think of that, what is the likelihood that an elementary student's parent who's working those hours is going to have the adult support for their schoolwork? And would it be the same as parents who are home every evening? Also, we have to think about how our biases play into how we interpret when students do or do not do their homework. So stereotypes like they don't value education or that their parents don't value education, when we know that really research disproves these biases. And again, there's research behind this, and that is also on that slide towards the end of the presentation that talks about how our biases have been disproved through research. So what's a systemic change that could happen? Instead of maybe a punitive response to late or missing work, maybe they could develop a new homework policy that's equitable for all students. So what would be something that wouldn't disadvantage some students over others? Maybe no homework outside of the school. That would be a policy change. Maybe have it done within the classroom. This could be a school policy change, or it could be an individual adult practice change. Or if we think about reading logs, the reading log practice may benefit some students because their parents are home. But if a student's parents are working 96 hours, those reading logs may look quite differently, right? Because of the lack of time for parents to attend to it. So maybe we don't collect parent signatures for the reading logs. Or we could provide the time and space in our classroom for the students to read and build that love of reading so much that our students read at home because they want to. The point here is that we need to reflect on our current system and practices to inspect and determine if they are causing student outcome inequities. So let's just take a few minutes to process the information in breakout groups. We have a couple prompts on this slide. So one is to discuss one of the following common discipline policies and practices in schools and districts and how they could potentially cause inequitable outcomes for student groups. So we're looking at attendance, tardy, and dress code policies. And then what could be some potential adult or system practices that could be changed to provide more equitable student outcomes. Stephanie will share that out. It looks like almost everyone's back. We have a few more.
Attendance, tardy policy, flexible starts to school to allow for late starts, dress code, attendance, how different it will look coming back once students get sick or during virtual learning. Dress code due to dress on online classes. Homework policies seem to be in place because it's always been this way. Consider outside factors that families are going through. Language communicated regarding attendance, open dialogue with families, policy of recess gear for outdoors, consistency. The attendance can be out of students' control, flexibility on school times, offerings incentives for coming to school instead of discipline for not. Attendance change policies to consider culture, rural communities, farming. Tardy classrooms could adjust their top of the hour norms so that the general class is not disrupted by latecomers. Policies can be adjusted. Absolutely, they're not meant to be the same forever. So that's what I've got, Jen.
Okay, thank you. Was there something else that?
Yes, yes, thanks for the reminder. So we had a question that was excellent about going back to the student groups, and do those percentages indicate that additional students need support in for tier 2, need additional support through your tier 2 system or your tier 2 strategies? So Deidre was going to talk about that.
So I'll just briefly reiterate what Jen said. I just think that it's really important that if we notice that there's a disproportionate representation of any student groups that we're noticing would be maybe hitting our data indicators for needing tier 2 support. If there's disproportionate group representation in that, then we need to go back to the universal and see what is it about our universal that's not supporting whatever student group we're talking about equitably. So we can't address those universal barriers with a tier 2 intervention. We need to look back to the universal and think about what that could be. And there's a whole bunch of universal barriers that we could talk through, but I think this is a place that would be a really good place to make a note in your reflection document and reach out to your technical assistance coordinator, or perhaps ask for some support this afternoon in that supported work time in the virtual rooms this afternoon.
Thank you, Deidre. So Steph, could you move on to the next slide? We had some great ideas, and if you want to take a moment, chat something down or jot something down in your book or your journals, your reflection document. And you can advance the slide. Thank you. So once we've identified our underserved student groups and the practices and policies within that system that create inequitable outcomes, we can start using our system data, such as the TFI, to ensure the universal implementation of those practices and policies are being done to fidelity. So the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, is an assessment that allows us to check the health of our system and where we can improve the delivery of equitable practices within that system. And what I've noticed with schools and districts that I work with is that there are patterns of some student groups that show up as in need of more support, such as areas like attendance, office discipline referrals, academic achievement. I gave you an example earlier about students with IEPs that you might see them showing up in that attendance, office discipline, academic achievement, maybe not feeling they're connected with an adult. So if you think of a student group, an underserved student group in your building, so we'll just go with students that have IEPs. If they have more referrals for behavior, more tardies, just that overall less engagement, when you think of them as you take your tiered fidelity inventory, knowing who that underserved student group is in your building and throughout your district, you might be able to have a deeper conversation and discussion around item 1.4 on the TFI, which specifically it is expected academic and social behaviors are taught directly to all students in classrooms and across other campus settings and locations. So if you reflect on your aggregate data and just the data we used before, we could say it's a 2, right? Because we have 85% of our students. But if we think of our students with IEPs and that we weren't supporting them solely at that universal level, we would want to dig into that. So knowing that and looking through that lens of students with IEPs, in some schools, they're pulled out for special education supports. Many times special education staff are not present for professional development. So this gives us different data points to view the health of our system. And when you think of that, they would probably score their TFI at a more realistic 1, which is specific that the expected behaviors are not taught consistently in all locations. If we think of that, the students are pulled out, as well as the special education staff are not part of the PD, so they're not getting it consistently or in all locations. So we need to think of that as you take your tiered fidelity inventory or your system assessments. Who are your underserved populations? Because you're going to get much more accurate information in order to develop better action steps that will result in improved student outcomes. So using student data alone to determine the health of your system would not bring a team to identify a need to change district policy or adult practices. It's that system level data used with your student level data that gives your teams the tools to reflect and inspect on your current system. In addition, if schools use adult practice observation tools, such as the classroom management observation tool, and that is another resource that I've linked at the end of the presentation, teams would have a more direct data source for identified and defined adult practices to inform their decisions about the adult support needs. So I encourage you to connect with your regional technical assistance coordinator to learn more about various forms of adult practice data, and also to have them facilitate your tiered fidelity inventory. Their knowledge of that whole process is going to bring more clarity and meaning to your system assessment as you move through that process. So to wrap up this first outcome of the day, which is to develop awareness of how data is used to adjust adult practices and policies for equitable outcomes, I want to reiterate that each school and district needs to know who their underserved student groups are and recognize the need to examine their systems and their structures to create that create inequities for students and sometimes our staff, such as the example I gave where special education staff aren't included in PD opportunities. That's inequitable for our staff as well. So knowing this will give us an accurate assessment of where we need to make our changes in our practices and our policies to ensure equity for each and every student and staff member. This is accepting institutional responsibility. So considering the content from this section that applies to the first outcome, we're going to send you to some breakout rooms, and we want you to process through the prompts that are on this slide. You might want to take a picture or capture that. And in your breakout groups, be prepared when you come back to share out 3 key points that you could remember.
I'm going to start reading. PBIS needs to be a team approach, not just a tier 1 coach. Importance of disaggregating data in meaningful ways. Need to look at who we are serving and who might be underserved and think about the policies. PBIS is all about changing adult behavior. Use data to change adult behavior. Look at staff reporting in terms of who's reporting, which students. Is it about building better relationships with the students or giving needed extra support? Be sure that we are intentional in trying to meet the needs of student groups who are being underserved. Data can feel personal when it's shared ineffectively, yes. Include the caveat of Q-tip, which I've not heard this before, quit taking it personally. I think I'm gonna start to use that with my own children at home. Q-tip. Have a clear definition of what warrants an office discipline referral so it is consistent between staff members, yes. We need to drill down the data into subgroups to better understand whether we are reaching everyone at that universal level. Remove barriers to help students be successful. Yes, examine the policy with outside lens to determine cultural roles. Wonderful, thank you everybody for sharing out.
And thank you, Stephanie, for summing up that chat. So finally, we do want to provide you just some time to reflect on your thoughts around this section, maybe some Stephanie just shared out as well. Think about how you can take this new learning back to your building. Think about how you could disaggregate your data and look at your system assessment data to adjust some systemic implementation errors.
One of the areas we highlighted was the shift from thinking about teaching behavior as a one-time event to approaching it through that same instructional lens in which we think about teaching academics. Feedback is an important component of that instructional model. This afternoon, we're going to take some time thinking about why trust is essential for creating that safe and supportive learning environment needed to teach behavioral skills through an instructional model. As we examine the 2 PBIS features of teach, prompt, and provide feedback, and provide an instructional response, consider the possible adaptive challenges that could arise for your team when training and supporting staff to think about teaching behavior skills through an instructional lens. Make sure to note any of your reflections on these potential adaptive challenges in your reflection document so that you can reach out to your TAC to support you in that work. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about response to behavior through an instructional lens and how feedback is a critical component of that instruction. Our first consideration then needs to be creating the trusting learning environments in which feedback will be most effective. In order to begin thinking about teaching behavior in the same way that we think about teaching academics, we need to reflect on the environment necessary for learning. If you were able to attend Dr. Neese's keynote on Monday morning, you'll remember that we've learned from brain science that there's a direct connection to the brain's response to the environment and the release of cortisol in learning or the lack of learning. In her book, Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Zaretta Hammond shares with us that fear activates the amygdala in the brain, which then releases the hormone cortisol. The amygdala takes over the brain's other systems, and it leads to that fight, flight, or freeze response. Cortisol then stops and prevents all learning opportunities for a full 20 minutes, and then stays in the body for up to 3 hours. 3 hours. That's a long time to not be learning. That's like a half a school day. So trust, on the other hand, deactivates the amygdala, which in turn blocks the release of cortisol, therefore freeing the brain and allowing us to learn. That is when the release of those happy hormones that Dr. Neese mentioned in her keynote interrupts the brain's fear response because of the established positive relationships and the feelings of being acknowledged and valued. The implication is that when we experience a fearful event, trust can mitigate our fear response so that learning can continue. Think about what that means in our current realities of returning to school in its various forms this fall. What practices will we as leadership teams need to identify and support all adults in delivering with fidelity so that we can create those necessary high trust learning environments? What practices can we identify, define, train, and support all staff in creating and maintaining those relationships? It's important to remember that these brain events have critical impact on our students' learning environments. So when we think about the brain's need to feel safe in order to learn, and we consider how some traditional practices for classroom management can impact that sense of trust. For example, the PBIS National Center released a practice brief called Ditch the Clip. The brief details several reasons why clip charts are not a PBIS practice. Not only are clip charts ineffective in changing behavior, they contribute to labeling, stigmatizing, and they increase anxious behavior, which, as brain science will tell us, decreases engagement. If our intent is to set up safe learning environments in order to teach both academics and behavioral skills, practices that contribute to labeling, stigmatizing, and intensifying anxious behavior are going to work in direct opposition to our goals. Remember, a critical part of creating safe learning environments means that we ensure that each and every student feels that they're a valued member of our classroom and that they belong. It's important that we review our practices to make sure that we're not creating environments that, however unintentionally, lead students to feeling stigmatized or othered. Additionally, research shows us that stigma can increase the likelihood of future challenges and lead to exclusionary discipline. And that research shows us that that has a disproportionate impact on our students of color. So let's think back to this morning when we talked about centering equity and examining our system's impact on students and families. Remember, across all ages and grades, Wisconsin's education system has yielded persistent and equitable outcomes for some student groups. Achieving equity in Wisconsin schools demands a bold commitment to deliberately address these unacceptable outcomes. So here's a place that we need to focus on that bold commitment. We're going to spend a few minutes looking at our state's exclusionary practices outcome data disaggregated by race ethnicity. This chart shows the outcome data of suspension by race ethnicity in our state in the 2013-14 school year. In relation to exclusionary practices, Wisconsin's education system has yielded particularly inequitable outcomes for our Black students. Looking at suspension data, we see that the suspension rate of Black students in our state was at 17% compared to 4% for all students. This data shows our expulsion data disaggregated by race ethnicity. The expulsion rate per 10,000 students shows that the rate of our Black students was at 48 compared to 9 for all students. When looking at this data, it's especially important for us to consider that model to inform, specifically the piece that asks us to accept institutional responsibility. This is a place that we might need to lean into an adaptive challenge in order to make sure that all adults in our system recognize that addressing these inequitable outcomes depends on changing the schools and districts' policies and practices rather than fixing learners and families. The research also notes that the majority of disproportionality and behavior outcomes between Black and white students is the result of subjective behaviors, things like defiance, disrespect, and disruption, which lead to office disciplinary referrals. Interpreting subjective behaviors is far more influenced by personal feelings and opinions. So this not only brings our attention to the system's need to address the technical challenges of clearly defining those problem behaviors and to support all staff in learning and developing an instructional response to behavior, but also our need to lean into that adaptive challenge of becoming self-aware, which is a piece of that model to inform. In other words, as an educator, I need to think about how my beliefs and biases might affect the way that I interpret and respond to behaviors of different groups of students. In the book Unconscious Bias, the authors write that a factor that contributes to both school and classroom climate is the way that we as educators respond to behavior. Fair treatment promotes a feeling of safety and respect. Unfair treatment leads to wariness, suspicion, and an overall negative climate. So when students perceive a discipline system as unfair, their trust in people administering the system erodes. As leadership teams, it's important that we consider and attend to the adaptive work involved in supporting all adults in our system to engage in the ongoing work of developing self-awareness and the ability to recognize and respond to bias in order to create trusting learning environments for all students. For more information and support on learning about implicit bias, its effect in schools, and how to achieve more equitable outcomes for all students, please get in touch with your technical assistance coordinator. The brain is programmed to search continuously for threats, and when the hint of threat is detected, the capacity of the brain is spent minimizing threats and seeking safety and belonging. Positive relationships reduce the need to search for threat. And when threat is detected, these positive relationships that release those happy hormones that Dr. Neese talked about help the amygdala to stay calm. As adults, in the educational setting, it is our responsibility to create trusting and nurturing learning environments that the brain perceives as safe. In the team train support model, the work of the team is to identify, define, and support the adult practices and beliefs that Zaretta Hammond states are needed in order to build positive social relationships that signal to the brain a sense of physical, psychological, and social safety so that learning is possible. Before we move on to feedback within the instructional model, we'd like you to reflect on creating equitable and trusting learning environments. In your reflection document, take a minute to respond to the following prompts using the triangle, circle, and square protocol. Triangle, 3 points that you'd like to remember about creating equitable and trusting learning environments. A square, something that squared with your thinking. And a circle, something that's still circling in your head. A question, a concern, or a wonder.
Trust is key. Educating staff on the research and science of the brain, especially with relationships and trust. Also being mindful of what you say and how you say it to your students. Recognizing implicit biases in ourselves and neutralize them. Working to get rid of the subjective office discipline referrals. Clearly defining problem behaviors. Yep. Encouraging staff to reflect on their biases. Reduce responses that make a child stand out as being different or feel excluded from the group. The teaching behaviors just like we teach academics. Every teacher needs to develop trust, excellent trust relationships and being positive. We were talking about how horrible clip charts are and how some teachers who have used them for years have a hard time letting them go. Acknowledging the disproportionality in subjective office referrals, which accounts for most of the differences in numbers of office referrals between Black students and students of other ethnicities. We are wondering what are specific ways to build the sense of trust virtually. What are examples of activities that can be done virtually to increase community? Must be aware of trust pitfalls, especially in regards to distance learning. How will we respond to behaviors in and out of the classroom? Knowing each of your students and creating meaningful trust. And I think, just let me make sure, I think I have them all.
Okay, thank you. And as far as those questions go with, how do we create those trusting environments, really I encourage you to lean into the support from your technical assistance coordinator, and also perhaps to consider joining as a team one of the virtual team times this afternoon. We could probably spend a good amount of time talking about just that, but I think part of this is also, as your team is identifying those adult practices that build those relationships. So if you have people in your building who are really good at that, leverage that expertise as a way to build those skills as well.
Deidre, in addition, yesterday or Monday on B2, if you had any team members attend session B2, I talked about many strategies that can be used virtually and in person to develop
Perfect.
trust.
Great. Thanks, Steph. Yeah, that's another great resource then. All right. So please keep in mind that need to create and maintain trusting relationships and safe learning environments as we talk through this instructional model and how feedback is an important piece of that instruction. So we teach social, emotional, and behavior expectations using the same instructional model that we use for academics. If we expect it, we need to identify it, clearly define it, and teach it by modeling and providing opportunities to practice and give high rates of feedback. For example, if we were going to teach academic skills related to math and we were introducing the concept of common denominators, we'd start out by defining it simply. We'd then model how we find that common denominator, and then we'd give students a chance to practice it in the classroom while we monitor and acknowledge that practice, giving both specific positive feedback and corrective feedback to help students as they develop that skill. Through that multi-lesson process, we'd be assessing students' ability to demonstrate that skill and the various instructional practices we used as we developed those skills with students. And then we use that data to adjust for efficiency. We can apply that same model for teaching behavioral skills. So let's say that I was going to teach something related to conflict resolution. Let's say that I'm a social studies teacher and I'm going to have students working in partners or small groups, and we're going to be doing something related to current events that might bring up some topics where there might be disagreement. So I'm going to introduce, first I'm going to clearly define what I'm talking about in terms of conflict resolution skills that I'm expecting from students. And then I'm going to model that skill for students and then give them the opportunity to practice that skill in the classroom in those small groups or in that partner work. So at the same time, I'll be monitoring for that behavioral skill that I'm looking for and also for whatever academic skill I have for that particular lesson. And the whole time I'm going to, again, be giving feedback, both specific positive feedback and corrective feedback as students develop that skill. And then using that same data that I use with academics to adjust for efficiency as students are showing that they're developing that skill or not. And so then with the same thing, when we're thinking about teaching through that instructional model, we have to think also about the skill development of that skill within students. So just like in academics, we use an instructional framework to build behavioral and social emotional skills. We need to understand how those skills are developed so that we can support students with that feedback throughout the development of the skill. So this illustration shows the path taken in the development of a new skill. We teach a skill so students learn it with accuracy, all the while providing high rates of feedback and ensuring that the feedback we provide is understood and actionable for students. Students continue to practice the skill until it becomes automatic, and then we're still providing that feedback. Students continue practicing so generalization happens, and at this point we might not be giving as high a rates of feedback, but it's important that we continue doing so as students learn to use that skill and apply it to new situations. So let's think about this in terms of that skill development of conflict resolution. We may teach students some specific strategies in the classroom and give high rates of feedback as students develop those strategies in partner or group work. As they become more fluent with those strategies, we may not need to give as much feedback, but we need to help build that transfer skills for students so that they're using it in new situations, like perhaps the playground. We want to support that skill development by providing high rates of feedback in the new setting. So this also demonstrates why it's important that our teams train and support all the adults in our system to support behavior skill development. That way the adults supervising the playground can support those conflict resolution strategies with prompts and high rates of feedback as students develop that skill in a new setting. This way of teaching behavior can also be an area of adaptive challenge. Oftentimes in behavior we think that telling is teaching. So thinking back to my example from this morning and knowing that we would never teach an academic skill like adding fractions in a large group one and done in September and expect all students to be successful, the instruction of behavior skills also needs to be ongoing and provided in that natural context with lots of opportunities for feedback. And because behavior is so contextual, it can take longer for that skill development. Throughout the time that we're developing a skill, feedback is imperative, and our teams need to consider how we can train and support all the adults in the system to provide feedback in a way that supports skill development.
So Deidre's talking about monitor and acknowledge as part of the instructional cycle, and how important it is to ensure that we build skills with fluency, or till our students can perform those skills to a fluency. So that's really critical. John Hattie's research has identified feedback as one of the most powerful influences on learning and achievement. Most educators know this to be true in building academic skills. This is also true in developing behavioral skills. So you probably heard this theme throughout the session today, the academic versus behavioral skills, and we'll touch on that in a little bit in terms of corrective feedback as well. Effective feedback shows a student's current performance in relationship to the learning objectives. I'm going to say that again. Effective feedback shows a student's current performance in relation to the learning objectives and what they need to meet those objectives. Effective feedback not only tells students how they perform, but how to improve the next time they engage in the task. And it is provided in a timely manner as part of that fluid instructional cycle that Deidre was talking about. Did you know, and this is important, and new knowledge, for me it was new knowledge. Did you know that students to teacher feedback is more important than teacher to student feedback? What does this mean? Seeking input from students on their understanding or interpretation of the feedback, the content, or how the skill guides teachers to know what the students need. So think of this, questions such as, what did you understand from what I just said to a student? How would you use this feedback in your next learning step? Or is there more you want from me before you move on to utilizing the skill? These help the teachers know how to guide the student next. In order for feedback to be received by students also, and in order for students to receive the feedback, in order for us to give the feedback, we really need that safe, trusting environment that Deidre talked about earlier. Now, I want you to take a minute to think about a time when you were learning a skill. I can remember when a friend taught me how to quilt. And when I say friend, we had a strong relationship. She talked through each step as she demonstrated, and then I practiced each step before we moved on to the next step. Okay, so she provided me with feedback the whole way through this process of quilting, which was a long process throughout the whole process. I asked questions or asked for more modeling even, or teaching throughout the entire process. As I developed my quilting skills, my learning was very much like the skill development model that Deidre covered. Along each step of the way, feedback was a vital part of that skill development. For example, as she taught me how to stitch a straight stitch on a machine, she taught me how to guide on the machine works. So on a guide on the sewing machine, you don't push the fabric through, you let the foot do the work for you, pushing the fabric through. And at first I started to stitch. I would go a little bit and then I would stop and check my own stitches. And then you start to feel more confident and maybe you get off a little bit. But I would continue to stop and look at how my stitches were going. I would look to my friend for nonverbal feedback. And then I would ask her for my own feedback for myself as well, verbal feedback. And then she may say, can you see how you're veering a little bit? You may want to, change the way the fabric's going a little bit, and use the guide on the foot as your guide. That's what it's there for. So I want you to take a minute to think about a time that you were learning a skill. How much feedback did you get from the instructor? Was it specific? Was it positive? Was it corrective? A combination? Might be some challenging or new information for you, maybe. As we talk about the evolution of PBIS, this is critical. The evolution of PBIS has shifted from a strong emphasis on the use of tangibles or a ticket system to the use of specific positive feedback as the primary way to acknowledge students for demonstrating desired skills. The research behind feedback is clear. Specific positive feedback specifically describes the skill or behavior, provides a reason or rationale for the skill, and attributes success to effort and ability. The feedback tells the student what to do again, which helps to solidify learning and contributes to the student's desire to demonstrate the skill again. Let's talk about tangibles for a minute. For most students, specific positive feedback alone is sufficiently reinforcing to strengthen the behavior or academic skill. The use of tangibles at the universal level can be helpful when students are first learning a skill or when data shows that a skill needs to be emphasized. Tangibles are a tool in your toolbox and are not meant to be used at a high level on a continuous basis. You probably heard me correctly. Tangibles are a tool in your toolbox and are not meant to be used at a high level on a continuous basis. Continuous use can actually reduce the reinforcing value. Specific positive feedback should be used continuously and at a high rate. Remember, tangibles and tickets were never intended to be the it in reinforcement. They were meant to accompany the it of specific positive feedback. Tangibles serve as a visual reminder for staff. It reminds staff to watch for desired behaviors and then deliver specific positive feedback. A tangible must always be paired with specific positive feedback, so the student knows the skill that is being reinforced. It also helps make it clear to the student that the tangible was earned by the student and why it was earned. The ticket was not just a general token of appreciation. So we are going to go to breakout to give you an opportunity to think about this and to have some discussion around this concept of tangible or ticket system. You will have the choice to describe one of two options. Describe a time when the use of tangibles was beneficial, how they were used and how did you know it was beneficial, or describe a time when the use of tangibles was a barrier. How were they used and why was it a barrier? So specific positive feedback helps adults and students focus on positive social behaviors and actions and increases the likelihood of those actions occurring more frequently. When students know the expectations and are able to demonstrate them fluently over time, this reduces the need for corrective feedback. Specific positive feedback provides encouragement, which enhances self-esteem and builds locus of control. Locus of control means that the students can attribute their outcomes to their own actions. The use of specific positive feedback contributes to a safe and supportive environment. Be aware of who you are noticing and what you are noticing. This is another area where thinking about the model to inform and specifically focusing on becoming self-aware is an important reminder. It is important that we are aware of our own biases so that we are paying attention to who we are giving feedback to and who we are not. Are we giving stereotypical feedback? For example, are we giving girls feedback about their looks and their clothes and boys feedback about their skills? What are we noticing and what are we communicating to our students? Are we ensuring that our language is communicating high expectations for each and every student? Oftentimes, our students have skills that we are not recognizing. Now that we have talked about the benefits of specific positive feedback, let's talk about what it should look like. Students need to know explicitly what behavior they did that was correct and earned the acknowledgement of the adult. Describe the behavior observed to make the feedback clear and specific. For example, when I said it was time to begin your assignment, you cleared off your desk, got your materials out, and got to work quickly. It is a replay of exactly what the student did, framed in the words of your expectations. Explain the reason why the behavior is important using the overall school-wide expectations. You showed responsibility, and you'll probably get your work done in school, so you won't have to take it home. Specific positive feedback is contingent, meaning that it is provided when the desired behavior or approximation towards the behavior is demonstrated. Think of scaffolding. Consider the next step of success for a specific student in that skill. We often understand this idea regarding academic skill acquisition. Consider the example Deidre mentioned before about denominators. We would teach students how to find a common denominator, then how to find a lowest common denominator, and then how to add fractions with different denominators, all the while giving high rates of feedback as they develop those skills. We wouldn't just jump to teaching the addition of fractions. This is not always clear to us when we think about teaching behavior skills. For example, when we are teaching students to do group work, we need to first start with group roles, teaching and providing high rates of feedback related to listening, note-taking, and facilitation skills. Additionally, students will need some time to practice those skills and the roles that they are expected to provide, what skills do those roles require, while the adults provide the feedback to the students. And this needs to occur before we could expect the students to be able to do this independently of an adult. Specific positive feedback is timely. It is best when it's followed closely to the behavior so the students can connect what they did with the feedback. The younger the student, the more important the timeliness is. In the situation of middle or high school, or even some upper elementary school students, it might be better to wait for a private time to give the feedback. Some students get embarrassed with public feedback, even if it's positive feedback. This is another reason why relationships and two-way communication are an important component of feedback. Overall environments should maintain a rate of 5 positive feedback statements to 1 corrective feedback statement. This ratio ensures that we are reinforcing what is being done well and promotes a sense of safety and trusting within the environment. It is also important that the specific positive feedback be given in a manner that's sincere and appropriate for the student's age. This is especially important when working with older students. Staff need to find their own style of communicating sincere care and concern. Use a variety of phrases in order to show spontaneity and therefore credibility. In addition, some students may prefer written rather than verbal feedback. It is important to provide feedback in a manner that it will be received by the student. The best way to determine this is to build a positive relationship with the student and ask them. So we talked about specific positive feedback and how that needs to be at the heart of our acknowledgement system. Let's look at this. What should the response be when students do not behave in a manner consistent with our taught expectations? Let's read this quote together. If a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to behave, we teach, punish. Why can't we finish this sentence as automatically as we do the others? So punishment is the loss of something desired like recess, or adding an aversive like a reprimand in order to suppress behavior. What response do you see when kids are punished? Yes, I think that'd be great.
Great. So we've got anger, broken spirit, dislike school, defiance, fear, more of the defiance and fear, embarrassed, defeated, fear, resentment, caring less, anger, hiding, sadness, anger, frustration, outbursts, flight, crying, withdrawal, shame, defensiveness, negative attitude, upset, protest, battle, argumentative, shutting down. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing out. As we heard from those responses, punishment tends to create a brain response that leads to the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is what we hear when we ask that question over and over again. At this point, students temporarily lose the ability to learn, like Deidre said, with the cortisol lasting at least 20 minutes and spreading that out over even up to 3 hours. So they not only miss instruction, but punishment in and of itself does not teach the desired behavior. The focus is on what we don't want to see. In addition, a punitive response teaches the student that harm is a response to harm as opposed to restorative practices that teach us to repair relationships. Punishment fails to help us understand the student and fails to address the multiple factors that may be at play in the situation. Is our response to seek information to understand or just to reply quickly? Often not considered is the fact that we can be inadvertently reinforcing behavioral errors with the use of punishment. For instance, requiring a student with missing work to attend lunch in a classroom with their favorite teacher may result in more missing work. Punishment results in the student disengaging in the relationship with the person that imposed the punishment and overall fosters a negative classroom and school climate. Let's take a look at what research tells us some common responses to error are. First, let's examine some frequent responses to academic error. When a teacher notices an academic error, more often than not, that error is considered either something done by accident or is caused by a skill deficit. In response, teachers most often provide more practice and additional feedback. If the error continues, teachers carefully diagnose the problem and adjust their teaching and provide additional assistance and feedback until the student demonstrates that they have correctly learned the skill. Now let's look at common responses to behavioral error. This image is intended to be funny, but it is pretty typical that behavioral error triggers an emotional response. Teachers often assume that the error is deliberate or that it is caused by a performance deficit and respond by issuing a consequence or punishment. If the error continues, a student is often labeled insubordinate, thought to be exhibiting this behavior even though they know what is right, and have been told to stop. The student is issued additional consequences up to and including removal. Removal from the small group, the classroom, or even the school. That removal is maintained until it is felt that the student has learned his or her lesson. We are now going to send you to breakout rooms to discuss the difference in response to behavior error and academic error. When responding to behavior errors, we need to respond in the same manner in which we respond to academic errors. Always focus on how to build the skill. Keep the conversation brief, respectful, and private. When responding to errors, we need to consider response time of the student so they can process through the redirection. Response time is important and gives a chance for students to process what they have heard. Response time varies between individuals. We need to know our students in order to know what adequate response time is for each individual student. Use guiding questions with your students, having them think of the situation. You could have a standard protocol of guiding questions. If the behavioral error impacts others, determine how the response can repair the relationship. And you've heard me say that before, repairing or restoring the relationship. That's what we want to teach our students ultimately. Follow up corrective responses with specific positive feedback as soon as you see the error corrected. That's giving them the positive reinforcement regarding the skill you want to see. So tying this information to what we talked about with regards to clip charts, no matter their modifications, clip charts are not an instructive response. They are often used without any instruction from the adult in the setting. In addition, they are public displays and they focus on what not to do. So here are some additional considerations regarding responding to behavior errors. A consequence is the response to the behavior. It does not have to mean punitive. A consistent response should always be an instructive response. As educators, we need to slow down when making decisions when responding to behavioral errors. Teach all staff to slow down by asking them to become self-aware of their own triggers and identify steps to pause. Let's talk about triggers. What do you tend to respond to quickly? Maybe it's hearing a specific swear word, or maybe it's when we perceive a student's behavior as disrespectful. Teach staff to pause before responding to behavior errors. Create some statements for your staff to use. For example, they could say, "I'll get back to you after I've had some time to think about what just happened." Or, "I want to be able to talk in private, so let's talk after class." Immediate feedback is best, but does not take precedent over respectful instructional feedback. Response to behavior error needs to keep students in the instructional setting, except in the rare situations when the behavior is violent or dangerous. Teach all staff de-escalation strategies, and teach all staff and students social and emotional skills, including calming strategies. Clearly define all behaviors to ensure that even behaviors such as disrespect, defiance, and disruption are objective. Remember when we looked at our Wisconsin outcome data, which showed our students of color, specifically our Black students, disproportionately affected by exclusionary practices? Students of color are referred for more arbitrary and subjective concerns and for less serious offenses that may not result in a referral for a white student, which leads me to the final and probably the most important consideration. Becoming self-aware means knowing our implicit biases. We all have them, and they impact our responses to students. Please remember to reach out to your technical assistance coordinator to learn more about implicit bias. Thank you so much for joining us.